8:42 a.m. Sunlight slanted through the rows of old trees in front of the Greenville City Courthouse in South Carolina, casting long shadows across the hot asphalt. Kennedy's silver-gray car pulled quietly into the lot. He leaned back in his seat and exhaled, a heavy breath laced with pressure and exhaustion. Kennedy hated being late, not because he feared reprimand, but because lateness meant letting others lose faith in him. And today, he was coming to correct a systemic mistake. The case seemed minor. A misjudgment in property tax valuation on the worn-down house his grandmother had left behind. But to Kennedy, that house wasn't just property. It was origin. It was where he learned to tie his shoes, did his homework under a dim yellow lamp, and listened to stories from his grandmother about the first Black Americans who won the right to vote. Keeping that house meant keeping his roots. That morning, Kennedy had planned to arrive early, but a phone call from the office held him back. The defense attorneys in a major human trafficking case had just filed an emergency motion to dismiss key evidence. He couldn't ignore it. That case wasn't just a matter of duty. It was about the lives of the victims. After helping draft and send the response brief to the investigation team, Kennedy finally hit the road. Eyes on the clock, foot pressed to the gas, tension coursing through him. Just a few blocks from the courthouse, his phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Heads up. Judge Daniel is known to be unforgiving with late arrivals. Kennedy smirked. He'd dealt with tougher judges before. What gave him confidence was the evidence he held, his solid reasoning, and the fact that truth was on his side. But he didn't know. Today wouldn't just be a property tax hearing. Today would be the day he would have to rise. Not for himself, but for those long silenced by injustice, wearing the robe of law. And right here, in that worn-down courtroom, the first wave would begin to rise. The door to courtroom 204 closed behind Kennedy with a heavy click. Inside, the air was thick, a mix of old paper, worn wood, and the quiet tension of people waiting. They clutched stacks of documents, their eyes filled with worry and fatigue from having to explain themselves to a system that never truly seemed to listen. Kennedy quickly found a seat near the back row. He flipped through his file, double-checking the tax assessments and the handwritten letter from the property appraisal office. Everything was in order, except that he was late. "All rise." The voice of the court officer rang out as Judge Daniel entered. He was tall, silver-haired, and imposing. His sharp eyes scanned the courtroom with a gaze so piercing it made people sit straighter without even being called upon. Kennedy stood tall, locking eyes with the judge for a brief moment. A silence hung longer than usual. Cases were called one after another. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit quietly entered late and sat down. No one said a word. A few minutes later, a young woman in a t-shirt and jeans slipped in through the back door. No heads turned, no glares, no gavel, no reprimand. 9:15 a.m. Kennedy Robinson. The coordinator's voice rang out. Kennedy rose, walked to the front in a crisp navy suit, face composed and confident. He opened his file, ready to present his argument. But before he could speak, "You're late." Judge Daniel's voice cut in, cold as steel. "Do you think this court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kennedy paused, taken aback. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was just handling an emergency involving human trafficking and no excuses." The gavel slammed down hard, slicing through his sentence. "Your tardiness is an affront to the order and discipline of this courtroom. I'm fining you $750 for contempt." The courtroom froze. Kennedy's expression remained composed, but a fire ignited inside him. His eyes flicked briefly toward the benches. The middle-aged man remained silent, the young woman still glued to her phone. Neither had been reprimanded. Not a word, not a fine. Only him, a black man, a federal prosecutor. The contrast, unspoken, was unmistakably clear. Kennedy took a deep breath. He nodded quietly. Understood. And in that moment, he knew. This wouldn't end here. Kennedy returned to his seat, still holding his file, but his eyes were no longer fixed on the numbers. He was observing, analyzing, calculating. He had just been publicly fined, denied the right to explain, cut off mid-sentence, while others who arrived late were simply ignored as if they hadn't even entered. One didn't need to be a lawyer to see it clearly. The law was not being applied fairly. His name was called, again. Kennedy stood once more, this time more slowly, no longer proud, but deliberate. He placed the file on the stand and presented his case in a steady, unwavering voice. Your Honor, these documents prove that the tax increase on property number 79 Rosewood Street was due to an error in the appraisal process. The evidence includes 5 years of tax records, photographs of the property's condition, and a signed statement from the appraisal office. Judge Daniel didn't look at the documents. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I'll review it later. However, we're not done discussing your tardiness this morning. Your Honor, Kennedy replied, still calm. I was managing a federal human trafficking case. The matter required immediate response to protect a minor witness. I left a federal hearing and came here directly. Daniel raised an eyebrow, shaking his head slightly. No matter what you were doing, you still violated the court's protocol. In here, everyone follows the same standard. No one gets special treatment. But Kennedy knew all too well. Not everyone was being held to that same standard. He lifted his head, looking directly at the judge. Then may I ask, Your Honor, is that standard being applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? A wave of silence swept through the room. Judge Daniel leaned forward, his face gradually reddening. Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson? Kennedy replied crisply, each word clear. I'm seeking clarity, because justice must begin with fairness. The gavel struck again. I will not entertain any such accusations. Your fine stands. Kennedy bowed his head without protest, but in his mind, the pieces had come together. The unreasonable penalty, the obvious favoritism, the dismissal of a valid explanation. And now, Kennedy was no longer just defending his grandmother's house. He was defending the very principle upon which this court was built. Justice has no color. The courtroom had mostly emptied, with only a few people lingering, gathering their files. Judge Daniel remained seated at the bench, head down, sifting through papers, or perhaps just pretending to be busy. Kennedy slowly walked back toward the stand, this time no longer carrying the property tax documents. Instead, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small item, his official ID card from the Office of the United States Attorney. He raised it to eye level, his voice clear and resonant throughout the courtroom. Your Honor, if I may, allow me to formally reintroduce myself. I am Kennedy Robinson, Federal Prosecutor for the Northern District of South Carolina, under the United States Department of Justice. The air thickened, as if the room had been sealed in a vacuum. Judge Daniel looked up. His face went pale for a split second. The same blue eyes that had once glanced over Kennedy with condescension now could no longer hide their discomfort. Kennedy continued, leaving no space for interruption. This morning I came here as a private citizen, but what I witnessed cannot be overlooked. The fact that I was fined for arriving late, despite having a legitimate reason supported by documentation, stands in stark contrast to how this court handled others in similar or even more severe situations. He scanned the courtroom, catching the eyes of those still seated in the gallery, witnesses to everything. They said nothing, but none of them left. As someone sworn to uphold justice, I am obligated to report any conduct that shows signs of bias or prejudice, and I will do so, fully, officially. Daniel stiffened. His voice quivered slightly as he spoke. "If you have a complaint, send it to the proper agency." "This isn't the place for grandstanding." "No," Kennedy replied. "This is exactly the place where the truth must be heard, and I'm starting here." He placed the federal ID card on the wooden podium. Everyone in the courtroom, though only a few remained, seemed to awaken. A young law student in the corner clutched her pen, tears brimming in her eyes. A middle-aged man, perhaps a former defendant, nodded solemnly at Kennedy, as if he had waited for this moment a long time. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the silence carried the weight of a truth finally spoken aloud. Kennedy gave a respectful nod, retrieved his badge, and walked out of the courtroom. From that moment on, the story was no longer about a $750 fine. It became a far greater question. Was justice in that room truly meant for everyone? Right after leaving the courtroom, Kennedy didn't head straight back to the office. Instead, he sat in his car, opened his laptop, and began writing. The first report was 11 pages long. It contained every detail. Judge Daniel's inconsistent behavior, the way he penalized Kennedy while letting others off in similar situations, the condescending looks, the impatience when listening to explanations, all meticulously documented. Kennedy wasn't just writing as someone affected. He was writing as a seasoned federal prosecutor, sharp in reasoning, supported by evidence, and ending with an urgent call to action. The biased and discriminatory conduct of a sitting judge in Greenville is no longer a personal matter. It is eroding public trust in the legal system. The report was sent to the Department of Justice and the South Carolina Judicial Oversight Committee at exactly 2:13 p.m. that same day. Less than 24 hours later, he received a call from his superior, Julia Harper, the regional U.S. attorney. "Kennedy, I read your report. What you described isn't a coincidence. This is a pattern of systemic bias, and we will investigate." An official investigation was opened. The first wave of data was staggering. Over the past 5 years, defendants of color were fined at 3 times the rate of white defendants for the same types of violations. Late to court, 89% of white defendants were excused or gently warned. Meanwhile, 72% of defendants of color were fined on the spot. Plea for leniency or explanations involving family hardship were often accepted when given by white defendants, but routinely interrupted or dismissed when voiced by people of color. Injustice was no longer implied. It was laid bare in numbers, in testimonies, and in the silence that had lasted for decades. But Kennedy didn't stop there. He reached out to local attorneys, requesting a review of similar rulings in Judge Daniel's courtroom. The story began to spread. A young female lawyer recounted how her client, a black single mother, was fined $500 for parking in the wrong spot, even after proving it was a ticketing error. Meanwhile, a white businessman, with repeated illegal parking violations, received only warnings. An elderly citizen called Kennedy's office, voice trembling. "I thought I was treated that way because I didn't know the law. But I guess that wasn't it." And that was only the beginning. Just as the investigation began gaining traction, an unexpected name appeared in an internal report from the Greenville courthouse, Mrs. Marie Thompson, the court's chief clerk, who had worked under Judge Daniel for over 15 years. In her first meeting with the Judicial Oversight Committee, Mrs. Thompson pulled a small, worn, leather-bound notebook from an old drawer. "I always knew this day would come," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've written down every time he ruled unfairly." Inside the notebook were over 60 detailed entries, dating back to 2010. Dates, case numbers, defendant's race, type of violation, penalty amount. Notes on the judge's behavior. Interrupted black defendant, refused to let them speak, chatted politely with white attorney. Increased fine despite all documents being provided. Each line read like an alarm bell. At the same time, another figure emerged from the shadows. Mr. James Wilson, a retired courthouse security officer. He testified before the committee. I witnessed Judge Daniels say, "I know this type," always blaming their circumstances, right after a black defendant tried to explain their situation. When asked why he hadn't spoken out earlier, he simply bowed his head. Who dares to speak up? Here, a judge is like God. But now, I can't stay silent any longer. Those testimonies resonated with younger voices as well. A law student, who happened to be present the morning Kennedy was fined, wrote a detailed account of the hearing and published it on her personal blog under the title, Justice Humiliated, a Morning at Greenville Courthouse. The post went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 200,000 times. And then, like cracks spreading through ice, more people began to speak up. A mother recalled how the court denied her son legal aid because he didn't look like someone who needed help. A legal intern wrote, I used to think it was just a strict style. Now I realize it was deeply rooted bias. The courtroom, once the place people went to seek truth, was now the place where truth was finding its own way in. And Kennedy, the one who had sparked it all, remained silent, listening, but not from inaction. He was preparing his next move. News of the investigation at the Greenville courthouse was no longer confined to the legal community. After the viral blog post by the young law student, major media outlets began to take notice. CNN, NPR, The Washington Post, and even BBC sent reporters to Greenville. The hashtag #, Justice for Greenville, began trending on Twitter. Within days, hundreds of people shared their own experiences of injustice in small courtrooms across the U.S. Many of them were people of color, immigrants, or from the working class. A short video capturing the moment Kennedy held up his federal prosecutor ID and confronted Judge Daniel also began to spread widely. I do not just represent myself, Your Honor. I represent those who have never been heard. That sentence became the signature quote of a growing movement. In Greenville, social justice groups began to mobilize. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, held a press conference demanding Judge Daniels' immediate suspension. Law students from 3 neighboring universities gathered in front of the courthouse, raising signs that read, "There is no room for bias in the courtroom. Justice has no color." The mayor of Greenville, who had previously remained neutral, was forced to make a statement. We are committed to transparency, fairness, and will not overlook any instance of bias in our judicial system. But true change began from within. The South Carolina State Judicial Oversight Board officially expanded the investigation, not just into the Greenville courthouse, but the entire local court system statewide. They began reviewing, sentencing disparities by race traffic fines, tardiness penalties, and administrative errors, unresolved complaints, and ignored grievances, and the preliminary results revealed one thing clearly. Greenville was not alone. During a forum at Columbia Law School, a young student asked Kennedy, "Were you afraid?" Being the first to stand up. Kennedy paused for a few seconds, then answered, "I was afraid of what would happen if no one stood up at all." That quote was printed on thousands of posters, plastered on courthouse gates, inside lecture halls, on university bulletin boards. The fight for justice had spilled far beyond the courtroom walls, and no one could stop it now. In the 3rd week after the incident, the atmosphere inside the Greenville courthouse had grown heavy. The usual condescending glances were gone. The whispered comments behind Kennedy's back had vanished. In their place was an uneasy silence, as if everyone was waiting for something to collapse. And then it happened. On Monday morning, the court held an unscheduled press conference. A brief statement was released. In the interest of justice and community stability, I, Judge Daniel Whitman, hereby announce my resignation, effective immediately. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a quiet step back. But for many, it marked a milestone. A few hours later, the South Carolina Judicial Oversight Committee announced a series of reforms. Mandatory bias training for all local-level judges. Periodic reviews of rulings and sentencing decisions to detect racial disparities. Creation of an independent oversight board, including attorneys, scholars, and community representatives, to monitor courtroom operations at the local level. Greenville, once considered a sideline in the federal judicial system, had now become the launch point for a reform movement with the potential to reach nationwide. As for Kennedy, he didn't celebrate. I didn't defeat anyone. I simply defended the principles this very system once taught me to uphold. Instead of speaking to the press, he quietly returned to his office, continuing work on the human trafficking case he had once put on hold. But on the corner of his desk, he pinned up the $750 fine receipt. A slip of paper that once seemed small, now stood as a symbol. At the University of South Carolina School of Law, a group of students founded a club called the Kennedy Project, aimed at raising awareness about justice and systemic bias within the legal system. A small metal plaque now hangs in the main hallway of the Greenville courthouse, where Kennedy once stood before Judge Daniel. It bears just one line. Justice doesn't begin with the gavel. It begins with courage. Just weeks after Judge Daniel's resignation, the wave of public attention had not subsided. On the contrary, it began spreading far beyond Greenville. From the earliest social media posts by law students to bold headlines in major newspapers like "Justice No Longer Silent, a federal prosecutor exposes the truth in a small courtroom." Kennedy Robinson, the new face of U.S. judicial reform. Several cities across South Carolina began reviewing the operations of their local courts. Civil groups and young attorneys launched campaigns, comparing sentencing outcomes across racial lines, hosting public forums on courtroom bias, petitioning for transparency in judicial proceedings. In Greenville, change had begun to take tangible form. A judicial ethics center was established, with Kennedy's name honored as one of its founding inspirations. James Wilson, the former courthouse security officer who had stayed silent for years, was now in charge of professional conduct training for all court security staff. "We don't just maintain order, we uphold fairness," he said during his first training session. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk who had quietly documented every injustice, was appointed as head of procedural oversight. She led ethics training sessions and empowered young staff members to speak out when they witnessed wrongdoing. And Kennedy? He accepted an invitation to teach at a law school, not about victory, but about how a public servant can create change from within the very system they serve. In his first lecture, a student asked, "Professor, what's the most important thing we need to make a difference?" Kennedy looked directly at the young faces before him and replied, "Learn how to listen, not to argue but to understand. Listen to those who've been overlooked. Listen to the quiet voices. Because justice, if it's real, begins with the willingness to listen." At the end of the law school's hallway, a new photograph was hung. It showed Kennedy standing in front of courtroom 204, the courthouse behind him, freshly repainted, not to erase old memories, but to make space for a new chapter. Below the photograph, a small brass plaque read, "Not because I was special, but because too many before me stayed silent." 3 months after that fateful morning, the Greenville City Courthouse took on an entirely new appearance. The walls were freshly painted in bright tones. A new information desk stood right at the entrance, with signage in multiple languages: English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and even Swahili. Just to the right of the main doors, a small stainless steel plaque was mounted on the stone wall. Justice is the right of all people. Greenville City Courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere had changed as well. Staff had been retrained, not only in the law, but in empathy and ethics. Every hearing now included an independent observer. The seat left vacant after Judge Daniels' resignation had been filled by a young judge of color, a former public defender known for fairness and close ties to the community. And Kennedy? He still chose not to stand in the spotlight. At the federal office, on the wall behind his desk, hung a quiet, dark wooden frame. Inside, it was the $750 fine citation from that day. Below the citation was a handwritten note in blue ink. It started here. Right next to it was a photo with the group of law students who had launched a justice equity clinic in his name. Their young faces, hands raised, eyes bright with hope. In the community, Kennedy became a symbol, not because he shouted slogans, but because he acted when no one else dared to speak. James Wilson, the former security guard, was now the lead instructor in statewide anti-bias training programs. Mrs. Thompson, now in charge of procedural reform at the courthouse, inspired the next generation of clerks with her fire and resolve. The law student who had once written the courtroom blog post had now become the founder of The Fair Bench, a watchdog organization monitoring small courtrooms across the American South. Kennedy's story spread far beyond the state. Other states like Georgia, Alabama, and Missouri launched similar investigations. A federal bill, called the Equal Bench Act, was introduced in Congress, requiring mandatory review of judicial bias across the country. One spring morning, Kennedy returned to Greenville, this time not as a petitioner or a prosecutor, but as the guest speaker at the grand opening of the Kennedy R. Center for Judicial Ethics. He stepped up to the podium. The entire room rose in applause. But he didn't raise his hand or smile just yet. He simply looked at the crowd and spoke slowly. "I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I survived a moment that should have silenced me. But I chose not to be silent, and because of that, thousands of others no longer have to be." After the speech, he stepped out of the building. A little girl, about 10 years old, walked up to him, holding a small notebook. "Are you the justice man?" she asked. Kennedy smiled and knelt to her eye level. "No. I'm just someone who spoke up when I saw something wrong. But if you do that, then you're justice too." As the sun cast its final rays on the freshly painted courthouse, Kennedy walked away. No longer just a prosecutor from a federal office, but a man who had turned a small courtroom into a wake-up call for an entire system, not through power, not through anger, but through one seemingly small question. Is the law fair to everyone?